Hello everyone, we might get started. So welcome. This is the panel on teacher data literacy, so if you're in the right place. I'm Kathryn Bartimote. I work here at the university in the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Education portfolio, but I'm also an honorary with Education and Social Work and quite involved in CRLI. Do you want to introduce yourselves? Well, that'll take too much time. This is Professor... That's right. This is Professor Bridgeman. He's the Pro Vice-Chancellor of Educational Innovation at Sydney Uni. Shannon Clark, who's a researcher and academic at Notre University. Jim Tognolini, Professor Jim Tognolini. What are you, the head of Measurement Hub? Yeah, so psychometrician, all things assessment and measurement. And you're probably quite familiar with Peter Reimann, head of CRLI here with Lena, and all-round interesting person. So we've got, I've sort of set them a bit of a task. If they start talking too fast, just wave at them or something. We've got sort of 4 questions, and then two of the panellists are going to have a crack at each of the 4 questions. But I wanted to also give time for you to shout out any questions or comments as we go. So we'll see how we go. So the first question, let's kick it off. First to Adam and then to Shannon. Why would, could, should teachers and education leaders use data in their work?
Thanks, Kathryn. So for a teacher point of view, I think you can understand your classroom from before you start teaching. So you can use something like, to be practical, something like knowing your student to understand who's in your class, the background of the students, where they come from, what other subjects they're doing. And you might want to tailor your course to that, or your expectations of where your students are to that. And then during an average class, you can be recording data from what they're doing in the lab or what they're doing answering polling as you're teaching them. So you can understand in the flow of a class, are you on the right track? Are your students understanding? Have you completely underestimated their background knowledge or overestimated how good a teacher you are? And you might want to change what you're doing. Every time you have an assessment, you have a load of information about how your students are doing. Every time they log into Canvas, you've got a lot of information about what they're finding useful and what they're not finding useful. And at the end of the semester, you've got a whole lot of curriculum data around how they've interacted with your resources, what they've found trickiest, what are the concepts that have been the hardest for them to get at, and that enables you to redesign your class to understand where your students are at. Do you want to talk about that as well?
Yeah, so in regards to how, why, and what teachers should be collecting in terms of data, especially in high schools, they can have a measurable impact upon students' learning over the course of the semester and a year. So what we try to do is to get teachers to look at a range of data sources, so not just the test data, they can use observation data. So to actually open pre-service teachers and teachers' eyes to the types of data that they can collect and use in classrooms. And with the change in the way the system is working, they need to actually generate empirical findings for their learning and teaching. And on the basis of their findings to generate learning and teaching decisions. So I think it's incredibly important for teachers to be data literate. And we need to bring this back into our pre-service teacher training so that they actually understand what data is and how it can be used to inform their learning and teaching. On time?
That's great. I guess as these guys talk, you'll understand how many feet they've got in different levels of education camps, so K-12 or high school research or university. But I'll let them sort of explain that as they go. Does anyone have any comments or questions on that particular question at this point? No? Did you guys want to add anything? Peter or Jim, on that particular question?
Yeah, so for me, and this pertains in particular to school education, so K-12. I think increasingly we also need data not only about students, of course, as Shannon was mentioning, that is a central purpose, but also many schools are engaged in innovation that goes beyond classroom teaching. They are having new buildings or new ways of structuring the sports facilities, or they might be worried about, the traffic around the school or the environmental sustainability and impact of of the school. And of course, these are all data rich, and the rest of the world, would look at such problems or challenges as a data problem as well. So I think increasingly we also see data practices in schools that are comparable to other organizations, and creating capacities in schools to also work with evidence that takes quantitative formats, and in that sense becomes increasingly important, I think. I'll hold this for you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think all those points are really important, and I'd agree with them. The thing that I think we've also got to think about is how teachers cope with the volume of data. We've got far too much data now, and I think our teachers are feeling totally overwhelmed by it. So it's an interesting area, is how do we get teachers to know what data to look at, etc. And I think that's a key thing which we'll pick up later on in other points.
Okay. Just moved on to the next question, which is the hardest one maybe. What is teacher data literacy, Peter? And don't show them the screen diagram.
Well, I had to use. So the question has multiple answers. So the one is you look up what people suggest, in particular in the States these days, on United States, on what makes up teacher data literacy. And one of the more accepted frameworks lists about 40 competencies, right? Amongst them, little things, and that's just one of the 40s, assessment literacy. Now, Jim spends most of his professional life just in that little box. The other 39, others do. So that seems to me a bewildering, amount of competence. Particularly if you think, how would I teach that to either university lecturers or teachers? That would be a whole area of study, a whole undergraduate degree. So for me, my view of data literacy basically comes down to that it's at the core, it's the ability to engage in evidentiary reasoning, right? So that you're able to support claims about students learning, about the value or the success of an innovation with data, whatever form they take. And also means that you have to be able to turn data into evidence, so you have to have warrants, right? So why and how can you link specific observations to specific claims? And evidential reasoning, can be taught, and it's part of critical thinking in some areas. It's part of things that are already taught in school, that are certainly taught at uni. So for me, that's also a possibility or a lever to bring people to data science and data literacy in that sense.
So Adam was the next victim for this question.
No, I think that's a very thorough definition. I think it's also important to understand the limitations of the data. I think the data is not going to necessarily, especially if you've got a huge class and you're going to have a lot of variation from year to year, the limitations of predictive uses of data, and also the ethical side of it, and the privacy side of what we might be gathering and what we might be using that data for. Obviously, the students that we're teaching, the children we're teaching, are going to be going out, and their data is going to be used elsewhere. So we also, a data literate teacher would also, I think, be instilling data literacy in their students. I think that's an important quality of the student, whether they're a high school student or a higher education student. So I think we want the teacher to both be ethically aware of the uses of data and the limitations of that data, and also I think to pass that on to the students and have them thinking about both the limitations of the data and the way that their data is used, as well as, of course, being able to use data effectively, because whatever career they're going into, it's almost certain they're going to be not only the subject but also the user of other people's data.
Yeah, cool. Any questions or comments at this point around definitional issues, scope? You're all looking at me very blankly. Happy to go for it, yeah.
So you said to share manager data with the students, to share the data as well.
Yeah, well, I think there's often a case for that, sharing their own data back with them to see what we're we are using your data and why we're using it, and this is your data, and even to give them the raw data in order to, I mean, many won't be that interested in that, but I think I think you get into trouble when you don't know what your data is being used for, or you're not aware that Facebook is doing whatever it's doing or selling it your data on. I think if you're acting as a role model in the way that you're being open with the data, I think that's very important. I think that's probably something we're kind of hesitant on, because we think that students might react quite badly if they realise that we are tracking in certain ways their progress. But I think if we're open with them, they'll be more up for it as a sort of a conversation that we might have with them about it.
Any other thoughts or comments? Shannon or Jim, did you want to put your two bobs worth in on definitional things about teacher data literacy?
I think one of the aspects of the definition that also needs to be clarified, and this comes back to what Jim was saying, was being able to ask the right question of the data. So I find that for many teachers, actually being able to ask a question in order to undertake their own research and to collect the right data is incredibly difficult. And then to be able to make a justifiable finding from that. Yeah. So I think understanding a research question and how to frame the research study to collect the data that they need is a skill as well that our pre-service teachers and teachers need.
I came across Nicole Mockler's work just by accident in preparing this panel, and realised that she was sort of putting education literacy and data literacy sort of together in one sort of camp. You know, just do teachers, she was particularly interested in school teachers, but are they accessing educational literacy and literature and research findings, and do they apply it? Are they able to and confident to apply it to their own teaching settings? And then she was also including extra questions, which I thought would be more the typical data literacy type things, you know, accessing, using, analysing data. Yeah, so it was interesting to see her put those two things together. Did you want to say anything else?
Only that, and I've got to answer question 3 in a minute. I was going to use some of this there.
Okay, you can ready, set, go.
But I mean, I'm not sure of Peter's definition, but I think it's probably from Mandanak and Gummer, which is my starting point for this sort of stuff. But if we talk about the definitions and ethical use of data, etc., one of the things that's really, really important for teachers and university lecturers is they have to be able to use the data properly. The misinterpretation and misrepresentation of data is rife. If you look at the NAPLAN stuff and all the problems, it's because people misuse the data. It has to stay within the context. What was it designed for? Therefore, I stay within that. And I think that's something that we have to teach. In fact, I think I was on television the other day when they were asking me about this, and they said, who's responsible for making sure that data are interpreted properly? And I said, teachers and principals. Forget that, because they asked me, is it CARA? Is it the government? I said, it's the teachers and principals. They have to understand the limitations or and the use of that data.
Yeah, cool. All right, well, let's move on to question 3 then, which is how can we or how are we developing teacher data literacy, or just data literacy? You can kick that one off, Jim, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, the way we're doing it in here, one way we're doing it in practice is we've gone through, because of NESA, they asked me to go through because they believe that teachers in schools, the biggest area of concern is the lack of data literacy and assessment literacy of teachers. That's the starting point. And that's come from the teachers, the principal association unions. So it's a top priority. So our starting point was what skills and knowledge do teachers need to be able to show the standard, the professional teaching standard associated with reporting and assessment. So we went through there, produced a whole pile of indicators, we want to call them that, outcomes, and we split them up. Half of them were how do you collect data in a faithful way, which is called assessment literacy, how do you interpret it and analyse it properly, that was called data literacy. We've taken those with focus groups and now produced a master's unit on data literacy where we've taken up all the things in Peter's big list there, as many as we could, and we start to work with teachers to develop that. And now that's also been built into professional development programs for teachers, and according to NESA, it's probably going to become compulsory, or there'll be a very strong recommendation. All teachers, as part of their development, will do that. At the university level, we'll talk a little bit about the graduate qualities. I think that's also going to make a whole change in the way we train our lecturers and etc. and they use data. So it's a really important issue.
Just on the graduate qualities, do you have a sense yet? The graduate qualities are, I guess, degree level outcomes that we have as less aspirational now and a bit more concrete. Actually, this version is really good to see. Sorry, I've been here a while. But do you have a sense yet of how people are going to try and tackle embedding data literacy into the curriculum? I know you're looking at measuring it. You know, did they develop it towards the end? But do you have an idea of how the university is starting to think about how that will get embedded in curriculum?
I think that is probably the one answer.
Good.
I mean, we have, one extreme we have a new major, so in sort of data science, so I think that's for the really devoted student. In terms of opportunities for students, we have a number of open learning environment units, which are sort of mini courses that students can take, either at 0 credit points, so anybody can take them at any time, or 2 credit point, which contributes to their degree. And in fact, Peter's got one of those. He runs one of those. So that's a way of students being able to reskill almost, or skill up if they reach the 3rd year and they find that they've got a limitation in their understanding of data or visualization that they might want to go to. In terms of embedding it in across all the majors, that's a pretty big task. And obviously in science, engineering, mathematics, health sciences, that's probably a little bit easier, where the data is sort of more obviously part of the course. It's probably a bit harder in some parts of the humanities and arts, but I think there's a responsibility there for all the reasons I was talking about just now, about making sure our graduates have those qualities to go out as data literate citizens, to embed them in those kind of disciplines. And I mean, all those researchers doing arts research are all using data at some level, whether it's quantitative or qualitative. So they are data scientists of a certain type. They're just not the same type as you would have in science or engineering. So they will get there, but it's going to be harder in some disciplines, I think, than others.
Yeah. Peter, did you want to add to what you've got going on and other things you're aware of about how data literacy is being developed?
Yeah. So our approach to data literacy development is sort of, I guess, complementary to Jim's approach. So basically, we start from the literacy point of view. So treating data literacy like other literacies, like reading and writing. Speaking of writing, we combine data literacy directly with writing. So in particular, because we work with a clientele such as teaching students, primary English, and with social science students if it comes to undergraduates and graduates at uni in other disciplines, who are not terribly quantitatively inclined. Actually, many of them made a choice to become an English teacher to avoid numbers and computers for a professional lifetime, which is slightly worrying, but we take that a bit seriously. So I think most of the people in that group think they are good at reading and writing, and they usually are. And so we combine writing with data analysis, right? So that the task is to write a data report, to write an argumentative essay that also uses data and uses data visualization. Not to do data analysis as a lat pour lat for its own sake, but to communicate a message, to be persuasive, or to communicate appropriately to various audiences, right? So you also learn you have to package data messages differently to parents in a school than to your management, right, and to your peers. And they have to learn how data travel more easily if they are packaged in some form than another. The nice thing is doing this that it's also very much aligned with what professional data scientists do. So data scientists over the years have developed technologies to combine report writing, because they have to write reports in the end. They just don't do just statistics or data wrangling. They have to recommend decisions and support arguments and be accountable in their argument, which is definitely more than just doing stats. So we use the technology as authentic tools that have been developed by the data science community to also then technically and as a social material practice support that kind of literacy. And I work with Shannon on that partially, and it works pretty well for the students we have worked so far with, and it's also a message I think that you can talk to about with in-service teachers for their professional development. Would you want to add to that, Shannon?
So I'm actually down the road at Notre. I'm not from Sydney Uni, so I work in pre-service teacher education. And what I actually do is I teach data literacy through the students' own lived experience when they're on professional experience. So they have to do an action research project, and they have a 10-week professional experience. And in that 10 weeks, they need to articulate a research problem and a research question. They need to collect their data. They need to be judicious about the kind of data that they're collecting. They need to analyse their results, and in the end they actually write up a journal article as their final submission for their coursework. So they actually get an understanding of the research process as well, and this makes them a bit more selective about the kinds of articles they're using for their own research. But then they get the understanding of what data is, how it's used, some of the limitations of data, to be judicious in what they're using to make their classroom decisions. And at the end, as with the changes with Notre and stuff like that, they need to prove that their learning and teaching is effective. So they need to draw upon a range of data sources such as pre, mid and post tests. They need to look at observation data. They need to analyse the student assignments. They also do things like little exit cards as a source of data. So they use a range of learning and teaching data to inform their classroom decisions. And the beautiful thing is because they're working across a range of KLA such as drama, maths, English, business, every study is unique and it is tailored to the actual class that they're teaching on. So in that sense, it's true action research. So they get an understanding of the methodology of being a teacher and doing research in your own classroom to make a difference. I do pre-teach the students in earlier subjects on what data literacy is, what assessment is, how to collect the data. I work with Peter on, I actually bring them up here to Sydney Uni where they learn about R and how to actually, it scares them every year. on the sort of the extent that they can go to in sort of collecting data and visualising data. But the nice thing is that at the end of the process, so they just submit all of their assignments, when they come in to see me to talk to me about it, they actually say that it's nice to see that their teaching is actually effective. So in terms of their self-efficacy as teachers, to have a measurable output from their learning and teaching rather than just stressing about things like learning and teaching, it gives them an understanding of the bigger picture of being a teacher and how they can actually have a positive effect on their students.
That sounds great. Does anyone else want to add any questions or thoughts about, yeah?
I find that really interesting when I guess when you say they give an overview of the research process and where the data actually fit into that. I'm just curious, what part of that do they find the hardest, where you say that they actually go through formulating the questions, collecting the data?
Formulating the question is the hardest. That's the bit where they struggle. So when they go into their pracs, they have 2 weeks to look at the class that they get allocated with the class and to identify an area where they think they could potentially implement some change. And being able to understand that as a question or something to investigate is fairly difficult.
Make it not too big or
Too small, and something that's valid and something that's researchable and something that is also, because some of the things they're looking at are things like how to make students happy. So we like more into like a move into something like mindfulness rather than their own learning and teaching approaches. So something that they can actually measure as a teacher in terms of their pedagogical practices. And then actually visualising the data at the end, like how to actually make sense of what they collect.
I'm also curious to know if you're getting them to think about what new forms of data they can possibly get rather
Yes.
than taking what we have right now and finding ways to answer questions. Are they also thinking about new sources of data or analytics or what that can help them?
Yes, so with that it's fairly open, especially with subjects like drama, because they might not be doing a pre, mid and post test. So from there, depending on the question that they're asking, I make them come up with 3 sources of data just so that they can start to build validity into their studies. And what they actually come up with is quite interesting. So some of them will even, they'll video the students and they'll get the students to reflect upon it. They will do, some of them will do little exit surveys. Some of them will actually survey the students in class. So they do use a range. Some of them will look at the work samples that they're getting. So each student will come up with a different range of data for their own assignments, which is nice in a way too. So I'm not telling them descriptively, you have to come up with these 3 sources of data.
One of the things is, the research question, of course, is the hardest. But what the teachers also have to realise is when they set out to teach an outcome, I mean, that process that you specified is practiced all the time. So you're basically teaching them a process. What's the outcome? What data am I going to collect? Or how am I going to teach it? What data do I collect? So it should be something that they built into their whole operation. And that's what we want. You know, not to think this is a special research project, etc. It's got to be, I want to find out about this. How do I do this, and how can I confirm it, and what am I going to do with the data, which is what you basically said, but I just want to make it a bit easier.
To pitch in there, I think it's a really good question, and I think at the core of my conviction that you need to see this teacher data literacy, be that at higher education or K-12 as an empowerment movement as well, right? Because at least in K-12, assessment has been, in many countries like the States and to some extent in Australia, but less so, being taken out of the hand of teachers, right? So it's a de-skilling of the profession in a key area of their, what's considered teachers' professional identity and capabilities. And I think in particular coming up with ways of being innovative, creative, yet systematic and rigorous and about, appropriate data rather than just those that are already at hand, going beyond the, what NAPLAN or the usual rubric quiz provides you with. And probably Adam should say a bit more how we at Sydney here provide lecturers with, data that go way beyond the marks and from last year or some such, and use data analytics quite deeply if a lecturer wants to use that. But I think at the same time, and coming back a bit what you said earlier, there's also the danger of having too much, not only too much data, but also too much options and possibilities and techniques and methods, right? It's just bewildering how. So to give you an example, it would be fairly straightforward technically to tell a teacher in English to say, well, you can look at your essays not only through the eyes of your rubric that you have, nothing wrong with it, but you actually could use those essay data and run them through a text mining algorithm. Well, easy, but then there are like a couple of hundred text mining algorithms. So which one, do you use, and how do you get to that one that you? So there's also a question of infrastructure, but again, the problem is often not so much accessibility, because all of this is available for free, and all of it is within minutes of reach for anybody connected to the internet. But the question is, how can you do that on top of your job as a teacher and at university, on top of your job as a researcher, and on top of your work as an administrator, and we call them leader. Sorry. So, and I think there's also things to be done on the from the data science end, that we sort of create unified framework so that you can use very similar ways of data structures that you use for your quantitative data, that you can use them also with textual data, right? So you don't have to go into and understand the details of corpus analysis as done, in digital humanities to do text mining and things like that. And again, luckily, the community of data science is very, very, effective in unifying their framework. So you learn some principles and you can apply them in a great many areas, right? But the point is, I guess, that at least in teacher education, few people at faculties of education or schools of education would be aware of those methods and frameworks. So there's also a bigger need at uni level to have these parties talk to each other. Adam, we do more with learning analytics than I know.
I think from a university point of view, where the classes tend to be huge and movement between movement between areas of the university is increasing, deliberately so. The data is quite complicated, and we do sometimes fall back at sort of a common dashboard approach, which can be effective because it does simplify the view, but can also sort of take it out of the hands of the teacher as well, because it might not be that meaningful for their class. And I think sometimes we have to talk to the teachers and ask them, well, how do you know when you're in the classroom? How do you know what's effective and not? Is it because they're all falling asleep? And how can you get that data? And if we're teaching, that would be a very good bit of data if they're all falling asleep. And how can you, if we're teaching a class that's online, or 75% of the student time is being spent online, which is not uncommon. It's probably higher than that in many units of study. How can you work out if they're asleep when they're online? And most teachers will sort of know about the classroom, but they may not know about the online environment and how you can get effective data without falling back to dashboards and last logins and attendance sheets and all sorts of things that don't measure engagement, they rather measure presence. So I think we've got a way to go. We have lots of institutional data. It's coming out of our ears, and we use it for everything from promotion to redesigning curricula to telling which students have got which graduate qualities or not perhaps in the future. But we probably at the teacher level, at the classroom level, we need to engage much more with the person that's responsible for the teaching and get them to think about. And maybe this is a way of getting more data literate, is to think about how in the classroom do they tell when something's going well or something's going badly, and how can you get that at an individual level when you've got 2,500 students in your accountancy class. And I think that's the way to do it, and I think the teachers will know instinctively, and I think with the data scientists to help them out, and educational designers to help them out, we can make sure that they're not falling into some of the traps that we've talked about, but actually getting that data and using it effectively.
Maybe I'll give you an example of the challenges that we're going to face. I don't know if Adam's realised it yet, but in 2020 we're going to be reporting on these graduate qualities, things like influence, communication, cultural competence, blah, blah, blah. And the way we're doing it is we start from a measurement paradigm. So we're saying, what does it mean to grow in each of these? Okay, and we describe it, and now we've got rubrics which have gone through academic board. That's fairly difficult, getting a definition of these sorts of constructs, but it's what we believe. Now the real challenge, which I think Adam is alluding to, is basically for the first time our lecturers are going to have to report on these, but they're going to have the evidence to say this is why you're there. In the past, just put a mark. Okay? Now you've got to make sure the task is measuring that aspect of cultural competence in your discipline, and that the evidence, whatever the student has given you in response to that, you can show that says, in relation to this rubric, that's where you are. And I think that's what we really, in terms of data and looking at different ways to assess now, all of us are going to have to rethink and be given the skills to do that, because I don't think there are many places now where they have to think, am I giving the student an assessment task which enables them to demonstrate cultural nirvana? In the past, here's a task. Okay? Now it's got to be, I've got to give this task sometime in that program where the evidence that comes from that will show the students where they are, but it will also show I've given the students a chance to demonstrate that highest level. Now, in our schools, we haven't got that yet. We keep trying with HSC, and I've just spent the last 3 days on working standards there. We still haven't got the questions which elicit the right data to match the standards that we've got. It's a hard task, and I think it's a challenge, but I think we should be up to it. We're a university. This is the area. Are we creating the right task to generate the right response, to be able to put the evidence against the rubric? In the past, here's my task, this is how I'd answer it, has the person answered it the way I want? If they have, they get the marks. If they don't, that's that. But the game's changing, and it's changed at school. In schools, we're starting to measure things like, in Australia, we're looking at critical thinking, collaboration, empowerment. There's a whole pile. In China, we're looking at happiness, patriotism. In India, we've looked at honesty, integrity, where the government's coming out and say these are important skills. We want you to say not only what they are, but how do you assess them, and how do you show that what you're doing in your programs is impacting on this, which is the measurement question. So you can see the context in which we're all working, I think. How do we get teachers to understand that, write good tasks, and then interpret the data to enable them to validly, use the word, and reliably locate students in their growth and describe what it is they know and can do. That's the world as I see it now.
Okay, I'm interrupting. Just in the interest of time, is that okay? Can we move on to thoughts about, you're sort of edging towards it, but I'm interested in what, Shannon, you could kick off, what you think the research space is in terms of research on teacher data literacy. All of you are speaking from a fairly agnostic point of view at the moment. There hasn't been a mention of theory. There's been a little bit of framework, but no specific ones. You know, so is there sorts of ideas that are feeding into a conception of teacher data literacy, or is there research on teacher data literacy going on? What's needed next, if there is, or what do you believe is the space there?
In regards to teacher data literacy, most of the studies that I've come across have been fairly descriptive in that they've looked at a single case where they've gone into either a school to work with teachers, or they've looked at pre-service teachers. What is missing, and this is something that I've talked about with Peter, is a theoretical understanding of teacher data literacy, which is where Peter was actually saying we looked at things through multi-literacies frameworks. Yeah, so I think there is a definite need to actually try and move beyond just the descriptive sort of understanding of teacher data literacy.
Is it a competency framework, do you think, at the moment that's sort of... There's a list of 40 competencies,
and that's what we do with
off we go?
Pre-service teachers.
Right, okay.
Competencies that they have to achieve when they're on their pracs, and we box tick them.
Right.
And data literacy and assessment and understanding them are just the competencies that we tick and say, yes, this person has actually demonstrated this, and they're now safe to go into a classroom.
Not until they pass the graduate teacher.
Exactly.
Yes, exactly. Which is coming when? Now, this year? Next year? Next year. The TPA. So that's going to be the big shift, and I think this is what is driving a lot of the sort of the desire, the impetus to have an understanding of pre-service teacher data literacy before they go and do the TPA. So I'll pass on to
I think, I mean, following up there, and with what Peter said, you start with that framework. We would start with that, and this is where I think we are starting to do research. Again, it's got to be what does someone who's really good at data literacy, what are their characteristics? So you start to build a measurement scale. Could be just a rubric. And so there's research in that. There's been a lot of research done on definitions. I mean, we can have books on definitions. There's been a lot of work done on, you know, how you do it. The areas that are weakest are how you measure it. And that's where I think there's a fair bit of research needed, and whether teachers are using it now. I think there's a big project that everybody's interested in. Once we've defined data literacy, where are our teachers in relation to that? Are they really good? Are they just starting? Where are their strengths, weaknesses? We need that. And I think there are two areas that I would pick, and there's another one, but I've forgotten it.
Fair enough. Together, my PhD students' thinking led us into, increasingly leads us into two areas to conceptualize, you know, not only what is data literacy made out of, but also how do you get there in a sense, right? So what's the underlying learning? And so one concept that we find increasingly interesting has roots in math education. So That's maybe a good area to look into, and basically, sort of goes back to all the way back to Piaget, reflective abstraction, which is it turns out also a construct that's increasingly used in computational to explain computational thinking. What's really at the heart of algorithmic thinking? If you read the recent literature on that, research literature, the concept, Piaget's concept, 60 years old, of reflective abstraction comes up again and again. So that's one lens, more from the individual learner. I think the other is more from the tool side, so more social cultural perspective. I mean, because data science, doing data analysis and gathering is so tool bound, right? It's digital, it has to do with, you have to use tools, be that Excel, a calculator, SPSS, R, whatever, Tableau. So obviously the tools play a role, and to understand the roles of tools, we are looking increasingly into how people appropriate tools, how they turn them from tools into instruments, from something that's given to them, and what they have to sort of make sense of and find ways of using for their own questions and their own problems. A process called instrumentalization in some circles. And I think these two things can meet, right? So that the classical psychological perspective, very well developed, in particular in math education, and the more social cultural, coming more from the study of work and knowledge work in particular. Obviously, I would like them to meet in the middle because we need to understand both, right? People are mentally capable of doing things, but they are using tools which are given to them and have a certain design and background and have been invented for certain purposes. And they have, I think at that intersection things can theoretically happen that might be a bit more informative how to develop data literacy capacities rather than just the well-known, competence lists or frameworks. Yeah.
Thank you. So we'll wrap it up there because it is time to finish. But I hope you enjoyed the session. Can we just thank the panellists? Really appreciate your time and really enjoyed listening to you all, actually. Thank you very much. So I think you've got about 5 minutes to move to the next session of your choice. It's another roundtable type session. Thanks, Annie. Good job. Method to my madness.
Just rely on it. I mean, they've asked me 12 months to go through this. Anyway, thank you. It's good.